On October 16, 1944, a little before 6 in the morning, the requisitioned farmstead that housed 3rd Army's forward command post was still soaked in the Lorraine cold, a gray-white dampness that seemed to seep into everything. The basement of the main building had been converted into the Corps Intelligence and Operations work area. There were no windows. The only light came from a few electric lamps fitted with heavy blackout hoods to prevent any leakage, casting rings of dull yellow glow beneath the low ceiling. The air carried a mixture of wet earth, old map paper, faint machine oil, and the near-constant smoke that drifted down from the coal stove upstairs. The click of typewriter keys, the fine hiss of static leaking from radio headsets, and the low-voiced exchanges of staff officers formed an unending background noise. Major James Miller sat at a long table against the wall beneath a hooded desk lamp, compiling the major intelligence summary that would be placed before General George S. Patton, covering the last 48 hours. The format never changed, brief itemized entries, each stating only confirmed or highly suspected facts with source and time annotated. No analysis, no adjectives. Miller's fingers moved over pages from 3rd Army's G2 section, copies of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Daily Digest, and transcripts of intercepted German communications. His pen hovered as he selected with care, a specific unit designation shifting on the outskirts of Metz, a report that a night patrol toward Fort Driant had met a newly emplaced fire point, a confirmation that fuel stocks across the divisions had dropped below 1 unit of supply and that follow-on convoys were delayed by mud. These were the heavy, concrete fibers of the Lorraine campaign, copied one by one onto fresh summary paper. Then his pen stopped on a line copied from the previous day's SHAEF G2 digest. It looked unrelated to the mud and the fortress line at first glance, but by intelligence standards it clearly qualified as major. He dipped his pen and wrote in a clear hand that did not try to call attention to itself. Confirmed information, based on consolidated confirmation in SHAEF G2 digest dated October 15th, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, former commander of the German Africa Corps and former commander of Army Group B in the West, died on October 14th. The official German announcement attributes death to complications from wounds sustained on July 17th, described as a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke. His successor as Commander-in-Chief West is Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Source: SHAEF G2. Daily Intelligence Summary, number 284. BBC monitoring record of German official broadcast from London. References in non-encrypted German rear area traffic intercepted by our radio monitoring unit. Assessment. Multiple independent sources corroborate. Authenticity can be confirmed. Potential effect on German morale remains to be observed. No immediate changes in enemy order of battle have been detected. He reviewed it as a matter of routine. The wording was professional, the information was accurate, the sourcing was clear. It was only a fact statement, no different in kind from the fuel entries and troop movement reports around it, all of it fragments moving through war. He placed the page on top of the stack, clipped it to the others, stood, and walked to the thick wooden door that led up to the ground floor. At the doorway, he handed the summary to the duty communications staff officer, who would slide it into a leather folder marked Commander Personal and carry it to Patton's temporary office. The process was calm and ordinary, as it had been for 100 mornings. The folder came back later that afternoon. Miller looked up from a pile of incoming messages as it was set at the corner of his table. He took it and opened it. Another hand had appeared on the pages. Sharp, forceful pencil strokes, sometimes so scrawled they were nearly illegible. Patton's marginal notes. Miller's eyes moved by habit over those pencil marks first. Beside 91st Division reports new anti-tank obstacles in the St. Quentin farm area north of Metz, there was a hard arrow and 2 words. Engineers, tonight. Under 4th Armored Division reports average fuel remaining for tank units at only 0.8 unit of supply. Some companies are no longer capable of maneuver tasks. The pencil nearly punched through the paper. Tell those bastards in logistics this is my blood. Tomorrow I want tankers. In the margin beside a report that the previous night's counterattack at Fort Driant had left Company C with 37 casualties, the handwriting grew short and heavy. Names. I want every name. Almost every item about the current fight carried that kind of imprint. Urgency, fury, grief, pressure. Each note a scorch mark where the commander's attention had landed. Miller turned a page with steady fingers. Then his motion paused almost imperceptibly. The item he had written about Rommel's death sat on that page. The entry was intact, his handwriting, the sources, the assessment, but in the broad white margin to the right, where Patton's notes usually lived, there was nothing at all. No pencil line, no check mark indicating seen, no question, no aside, not even an accidental stroke. The empty space, surrounded above and below by margins crowded with aggressive marks, made a jarring contrast. It was like sudden silence at the center of a storm, like a vacuum cut into a noisy battlefield. Miller stared at that blank margin for about 10 seconds. The basement sound seemed to recede for a moment. He closed the folder and tapped his knuckles lightly against the stiff cover. Confusion formed, small but definite. Procedure had not been violated. The general had every right to leave any item without comment. Yet it ran against a certain expectation. From what limited understanding Miller had of Patton, mostly scattered pre-war reporting and the stories officers told each other, Patton's instinct was to take a position on any opponent who carried a name, especially a famous one. Absolute silence felt abnormal. He did nothing immediately. Not until evening, when the urgent messages had slowed, did he pick up his steel cigarette case and walk into the narrow break area separated from the communications room by a single wall. It was usually louder and looser there. A few signalmen were drinking strong coffee. A familiar face from Operations Lieutenant Anderson stood by the wall map, frowning and gesturing. Miller lit a cigarette and leaned nearby as if idly, waiting for Anderson to pause, then asked in a tone as flat as small talk about weather. That big news in today's brief, when it went upstairs, was there any special reaction? Anderson turned, his face drawn with fatigue from lack of sleep. Big news? Which one? Fuel at the bottom, or Fort Driant adding 50 more names to the casualty list? No, Miller said, exhaling smoke that spread in the dim light. The more historic one, Rommel. Anderson blinked, searching his memory, then shrugged. Oh, that. Haven't heard a thing. At least nothing special came down to us. He pointed toward the communications room. Carson was handling deliveries. Ask him. Miller went to the doorway and found Sergeant Major Carson wearing headphones, monitoring a channel. The older NCO's face was lined with experience. Miller waited until Carson lifted one ear cup, then repeated the question in the same casual tone. Carson looked up with the calm of someone who had seen everything. Rommel? His voice was rough. Major, when the general got the folder this morning, I was outside the door waiting to bring in the next batch of messages. There was plenty of noise in there, but it wasn't about Rommel. He paused, recalling. He was cursing the weather for turning his tanks into iron coffins in a mud hole, cursing the supply line for moving like a snail. And while he was at it, well, he used some strong language about General Montgomery and the share of supplies Montgomery seems to get. Not once? Miller pressed. Not once. Carson's answer was final, and he returned to the sea of radio traffic. Miller left the communications area with his cigarette burned to the filter. He stubbed it out. Anderson had heard nothing. Carson had heard nothing. That was normal. A field army commander was buried under an ocean of information every day. Skipping an item that did not directly affect an ongoing bloody assault was professionally reasonable. So why did that blank margin remain sharper in Miller's mind than all the frantic pencil marks around it? He returned to his table and sat. The folder lay there. He did not open it again. Outside, night had likely settled completely, and Lorraine's autumn rain was probably starting again. In the command post, the noises continued. Major Miller decided he would observe. The rain on October 17th showed no sign of stopping. Cold water kept hammering the red Lorraine soil, turning roads, fields, and anything exposed into a patchwork of mud. Around the farmstead, the sound of jeeps and trucks passing was dull and struggling. Near midday, Miller had to deliver a translated message to operations. He crossed the soaked courtyard and hurried to an entrance on the other side of the main building. Under the roofed porch, he nearly collided with Lieutenant Colonel William Chase, one of Patton's aides, a steady officer whose face carried the look of exhaustion that had gone beyond emotion. "Sorry, Colonel," Miller said, stepping aside. "No trouble, Major." Chase nodded without slowing, a bundle of papers in his hand wrapped in waterproof oilcloth. Miller felt a sudden impulse, perhaps from the endless rain and the basement's oppressive air. He matched Chase's pace for half a step and spoke in the tone of idle chatter. "This weather's going to swell the whole army like a sponge. I wonder how the Germans are taking it. Their Desert Fox picked a fine time for an obituary." Chase did not stop. He only turned his head slightly and looked at Miller. There was no surprise, no curiosity, only a deep fatigue in his eyes webbed with red. "Rommel?" His voice was hoarse, almost lost under the rain. "The general knows the report." He hesitated for half a second, his gaze passing through the rain toward the south, toward Metz. "But his thoughts right now, Major, are about Metz, about Fort Driant, about how to get our boys back from those concrete works alive. Everything else," he shook his head lightly, tightening his poncho collar, "there's no room." Then he walked quickly toward a jeep with its engine running, leaving Miller under the porch. The rain hissed. No room. The words were not an answer, yet they pointed more clearly than any denial. For the first time, the blank margin on the brief felt connected to something concrete and consuming, not a conspiracy, not a maneuver, but a state of being filled beyond capacity. On October 18th, Miller was sent to a nearby logistics distribution center to coordinate intelligence and check whether a vague report about possible new German mines might have a quiet link to engineer losses. It pulled him briefly out of the basement smell of vacuum tubes and paper and into a different domain: heavy diesel, wet canvas mildew, sharp disinfectant, and a sweet, stale blood scent that no effort fully erased. The rear area was loud and busy. Truck engines roared. Men shouted as they moved crates. In an office labeled Material Dispatch, he waited for his records to be pulled and found his eyes drawn to the charts on the wall. Fuel stocks by division were almost all in the red, marked critical or scarce. Handwritten updates showed a glaring gap between deliveries and planned allocations. A logistics captain was on the phone shouting until his neck was red. "I don't care what division says. There is no more. What do they want? Tanks to drink rainwater?" Leaving the dispatch area, the disinfectant smell grew stronger, drawing him toward the field hospital tents. He was not there to visit anyone. He only needed a non-identifying casualty classification tally from the hospital administration to help gauge combat intensity in certain sectors. The tents stretched in rows. Muddy stretchers kept arriving. Low moans, sudden cries, and clipped orders from medics overlapped. Miller stood on wet grass a little distance away, holding the sheet he had been handed. It was columns and numbers: head trauma, chest wounds, compound fractures, shock. Each category carried a growing figure. Through a gap between tent flaps, he caught a brief glimpse of pale faces, blood-dark bandages, and staff moving fast between crowded cots. The numbers on the paper, the silent tanks in the parking area, the smell in the tents, and Chase's bloodshot eyes began to assemble in his mind without words. The blank margin on the brief seemed less like a riddle and more like a space being filled by weight. On the night of October 19th, the command post was slightly quieter than usual, perhaps because the weather slowed movement. In his corner of the basement, Miller spread out every scrap he could reach related to Rommel's death. Not only Schaeff Digest, but stray monitoring notes, a full translated BBC report, and even a few pre-war summaries of military analyses on Rommel's style, filed under Enemy Senior Commander's Character Studies. Dusty from disuse. He tried to play the role of a pure intelligence analyst, stripping away his fixation on Patton's silence and looking only at the facts. He worked until late. The hooded lamp buzzed above him, the light forming a clean circle on the paper. He compared timelines: the German official announcement, the first non-encrypted references picked up by monitoring stations, any abnormal patterns in German encrypted communications. His conclusion was negative, no significant anomalies. He read Schaeff's cautious note that floated the possibility of a non-combat death and found the wording extremely careful, the basis vague. It read less like confirmed intelligence and more like inference. Rommel had been removed from command and placed on medical leave, and now, during a period of political purges, he had supposedly died of old wounds. That logic invited suspicion, but it did not constitute proof. He noticed that translations of the German announcement varied slightly among news services. One stressed wounds, another sudden illness. The variation thickened the fog, but it remained fog. None of it, however suggestive, could be tied to Third Army's immediate dilemma in Lorraine. The fortress line on the map, the rain symbols on the forecast, the logistics tables with their red deficits, there was no direct, actionable chain. He closed the last file and rubbed his dry eyes. Reason told him that even if the event was historically significant, for an army bleeding for a few hundred yards of ground, it was background noise. The commander's disregard was professionally sound. Yet the strange sharpness of that blank margin did not fade. On October 21st, the rain finally eased. The clouds still hung low and leaden, but at least the courtyard was no longer a sheet of standing mud. In the afternoon mess hall, the air carried the warm but thin smell of stew. Miller took his tray and saw a somewhat familiar face at a crowded, long table. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Whitaker, commander of a battalion under the 214th Field Artillery Brigade. Before the war, Whitaker had taught modern European history at Princeton. Now his hands were stained with gun oil, and behind his glasses his gaze still held an academic calm. Miller sat across from him. They had spoken before about a report on German artillery deployment patterns. "The weather finally decided to show a little mercy," Miller said, cutting into a piece of stubborn meat. "Though it probably doesn't make much difference to the men up front." Whitaker chewed slowly and only spoke after swallowing. His voice was even. "The difference is that at least our observers aren't staring through rain and seeing nothing but a curtain. Though when they can see, it is often only to see more clearly how stubborn those concrete works are." They spoke naturally about the stalemate, Fort Driant's strength, and the tactics already tried. Miller listened, aware that the knot of the blank margin still pressed lightly in his mind. He hesitated, then decided to risk a question in an abstract register, avoiding any mention of Patton by name. "Sometimes I wonder," Miller said, choosing words like a man testing ice, "outside the specific fighting we're in. When those bigger names disappear, enemy figures turned into symbols, whether it has the immediate effect we half expect it to have on what happens right in front of us. Whitaker lifted his napkin and wiped his mouth with care. He looked at Miller as if he could see the question behind the question, but he did not pry. A symbol matters only while it still touches life and death at the distance you're fighting, he said slowly. A legend that no longer fires at you, no longer commands men who stand in your way, no matter how feared or how perhaps admired he was, becomes background noise to a commander who must decide where the next shell should land. And here, Major, the background noise is already so loud you can barely hear any single sound. Miller turned the phrase over. Background noise. It did not explain Patton's silence, but it provided a context in which it might exist. When the surrounding din reaches its peak, total quiet may not be an attitude at all, but something imposed by the limits of attention. Miller nodded and did not push deeper. They spent the rest of the meal talking about a new proximity fuse rumored to be arriving and what it might do to artillery effect. The exchange about symbols dropped beneath the surface, but something under that surface had shifted. On October 22nd, Miller received word that an old acquaintance serving with an infantry regiment had been wounded in a patrol clash outside Metz and had been evacuated to the Army's field hospital. For professional and personal reasons, he felt he should visit. The tents felt heavier than the last time he passed through. More stretchers, narrower aisles, disinfectant almost failed to cover a more primal smell. Miller found his friend's cot. The wound was not fatal. Shrapnel in the arm and shoulder, painful but not catastrophic. And under morphine, he slept. Miller left a small bundle of cigarettes and razor blades on the blanket and stood for a moment without speaking. As he turned to go, a blurred murmur from the adjacent bed caught his attention. A younger soldier lay there with his head wrapped in thick bandages. Only part of his face showed, darkened and peeling, lips dry. The voice was broken and weak, but clear enough to catch. Sand! Sand's burning! Fox! The fox is moving! Not there! They moved them! Wrong! Miller's body tightened. Sand. Fox. Rommel's nickname, the Desert Fox, struck his mind like a jolt. He stepped closer, heart pounding. Was this wounded man in delirium spilling some unnoticed clue, an old unit shifting, a connection, something hidden that might even relate to the report of Rommel's death? He leaned in, straining for more. The soldier whispered a few more fragments, mixing them with ragged breaths. Miller moved closer still. Then a doctor in a blood-stained white coat came up quietly with a chart in hand. The doctor glanced at Miller's rank insignia, then at the murmuring soldier, his face carrying the practiced calm of someone who lived among casualties. "Know him?" the doctor asked. "No, I just heard him say—" Miller stopped, unsure how to explain his interest. The doctor nodded as if he understood without needing explanation. His tone was flat, like weather. "Private Harris, scout with the 52nd Mechanized Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Detachment. 4 days ago in woods southeast of Metz, his patrol hit a well-camouflaged mixed minefield. He was the only survivor. The blast threw him into a tree. Skull fracture, internal bleeding. We've stabilized him for now, but it isn't steady." The doctor flipped the chart. "When he drifts in and out, he keeps repeating the same set of words. Sand, fox, moved them wrong. We asked his officers. Their unit has been in Lorraine for months. No one's been in North Africa. No one's fought Rommel's old troops directly." The doctor looked up at Miller. There was a surgeon's sharpness in his eyes. "In my view, Major, his fox is just his brain under fever and trauma, mixing old stories, propaganda posters, and the fact that his whole patrol vanished while he's still here in pain. He's searching for a reason, a bigger one, a reason that feels worthy of explaining why his friends disappeared and he didn't. It's common. In extreme states, people reach for connections, even when the connections are only mirages." Miller stood still, heat rising into his cheeks. The doctor moved on. The tense noise returned, moans, whispers, the small clink of metal. Miller watched Harris twist faintly on the bed, searching for connections, mirages. The words hit him like cold water. For days he had pursued the blank margin, trying to mine meaning from Patton's silence, trying to stitch fragments into a hidden logic, and here was a wounded private doing the same thing in delirium, inventing foxes and movements to give shape to an unbearable loss. Miller felt shame and something colder beneath it. Had he been making mirages too? On October 23rd, the turning point came in an unexpected way. General Patton summoned several key infantry and armored regimental commanders to an urgent meeting in a larger room in the main building to discuss a new breakthrough plan. The Fort Driant stalemate and the steady casualty list had reached a point where the top could no longer wait. Miller's assignment was to stand by at a temporary communications point outside the meeting room so that a freshly decrypted, highly classified message about possible German reserve movement could be presented the moment the meeting paused. The meeting had been underway for some time. Miller stood in a corridor that felt oddly empty. Through the door he could hear voices at first, blurred reports from different officers. Then a voice rose that he knew and yet did not truly know. George Patton's voice. Not the short commands or crude jokes Miller occasionally overheard, but a voice crushed under pressure and exploding. The door did not fully contain it. Hoarse, it still cut through the corridor. I don't want to hear difficult. I know difficult. Every inch of Lorraine mud knows difficult. Patton's roar snapped like a whip. I want solutions. Tell me how to dig those bastards out of concrete. Use explosives, use flame, use your teeth. I don't care. There was a brief gap as if another officer tried to explain. Casualties? You talk to me about casualties. Patton's voice climbed higher, pain and fury fused. I read the lists. I read every name. Those boys trust us, and we send them there not to rot on wire and machine guns. Every useless pause is another shovel of dirt on their graves. I won't accept it. This army won't accept it. The tirade continued, narrowing into supply bottlenecks, engineer support moving too slowly, artillery coordination failures. Every word was nailed to Metz, nailed to Fort Driant, nailed to the immediate grind of a battle that consumed men and time. Miller stood frozen. He heard Patton in the roughest language and the most naked anguish, cursing weather, cursing delays, cursing the enemy's stubbornness, driving and pleading with his commanders to show more judgment and speed. He heard again and again, my soldiers, those boys, they cannot die for nothing. For 10 minutes, perhaps longer, Miller did not hear a single syllable that treated Germany as an abstraction. He heard nothing about grand strategy, and he did not hear that name, Rommel, once. Not once. The name and everything it might represent, legend, history, reflection, was absolutely absent behind that door, drowned beneath a wall of blood, mud, and rage. When the shouting dropped into lower, urgent tactical discussion, Miller realized his palms were damp. The message in his hand was crumpled from his grip. Everything he had guessed, every indirect confirmation he had gathered, was sealed by what he had just heard and raised beyond argument. This was not concealment. It was not a deliberate avoidance. It was a tension burned down to ash. Patton's mind, like a searchlight locked on a single patch of ground, held only the silhouette of the fortress line, the broken links in supply, and the daily lengthening list of names. Silence was not a choice. It was what remained when everything else had been burned away. Late on October 24th, most of the basement lights were off, leaving only the necessary lamps for duty watch and the dull circle of light at Miller's table. Rain tapped the metal vent cover above with a steady, empty rhythm. The aftershock of the meeting seemed to hang in the air, but now there was only the faint rustle of paper and the scratch of a pen. Miller did not have an official report in front of him. He had a private, hardbound notebook. His hand was steady as the ink laid down clean lines. He was not drafting a document for any office. He was settling an account in silence, closing out the question that had circled him for 9 days. On the observation and analysis of GSP's lack of comment on the Rommel death notice, he wrote as a title. At first, this phenomenon produced confusion, given its inconsistency with the subject's typically vivid, outwardly expressed personality traits. Hypotheses considered included 1. Strategic omission, avoiding an attitude on paper that could be misread. 2. Deliberate silence as a form of respect toward acknowledged military ability. 3. Information failure, extremely unlikely and ruled out. He paused and saw again Chase's bloodshot eyes and heard the phrase, "no room." Existing observations and facts do not support the above hypotheses. A more reasonable explanation indicates absolute displacement of cognitive resources. Since the October 3rd assault on Fort Driant suffered severe reversal, 3rd Army's main effort in Lorraine has been locked in an unusually difficult war of attrition. Key constraints include sustained poor weather producing pervasive mud that severely restricts wheeled and tracked movement. German defense anchored on the Metz fortress complex and permanent works that blunt our armor and fire advantage. Logistics lines stretch by distance and weather, producing ongoing shortages, especially fuel, ammunition, and cold weather gear, resulting casualty totals that remain high and cumulative, consuming medical capacity and undermining morale. Mud, concrete, shortage, casualties. The words were no longer only items in a digest. They were things he had seen and smelled. Under these multiple pressures, the volume of immediate survival-critical decisions required at the command center, with the commanding general as the focal point, increases sharply. Each decision carries direct risk of personnel loss and of operational failure. In such a condition, the intelligence filtering mechanism becomes extremely utilitarian. Only information that can be translated directly into executable action for the next phase is accepted. Any intelligence that cannot be converted into a tactical action or that does not directly influence the current balance of attack and defense is pushed to the lowest priority until it is ignored. He thought of Whitaker's phrase, background noise, and of the doctor's calm explanation about mirages. Yes, Miller himself had tried to find a code inside empty paper. Therefore, the absence of comment on Rommel's death most likely reflects not that the information lacked importance, but that at this moment, for this command node, it could not be processed. It belongs to a different sequence: historical assessment, strategic reflection, personal reaction. Those sequences have been forcibly suspended at the level of cognition. The commanding general's attention, as if locked under a spotlight, is constrained to questions such as how to move tanks forward 100 yards in mud, how to assemble the minimum artillery support for the next assault, how to reduce the length of the next casualty list. Outside the spotlight is darkness. Silence is the darkness itself. He stopped and reviewed what he had written. There was no sentimentality, no moral verdict, only a mechanism laid bare, yet the mechanism carried weight. He wrote a final conclusion. Judgment. This blank is not an intentional silence, but a natural shedding of non-core information flows after cognitive overload reaches a threshold. It is a byproduct of command function operating at the limits under wartime pressure. Its significance is not what it expressed, but what it proved, that the current battle has nearly absolute consumption of the decision-maker's mental capacity. He closed the notebook without signing and without dating it. It was for himself alone, to clarify thought, not to accuse or to reveal. The rain outside seemed lighter. A strange calm settled. The question that had once felt sharp was now wrapped in understanding, no longer stabbing, becoming something he could carry. On October 25th, the routine brief went up again. Miller assembled it, delivered it, received it back. He opened the leather folder and looked almost at once for the familiar item. The Rommel line was still there, perhaps adjusted with minor updates, but unchanged in substance. Miller's eyes went to the right-hand margin. It was still clean. No pencil marks. But this time, Miller felt no confusion and made no attempt to interpret the blank. His gaze passed over it as it would pass over a verified line of routine data. When he looked at the frantic pencil notes around it, fuel requests, engineer tasking, artillery coordinates, and observed effects, he could almost see through the sharp graphite into the mud-choked roads, the anxious staff officers, the wounded intents, and the permanent red burn in the general's eyes from anger and helplessness. The blank beside Rommel no longer looked like a missing symbol. It had been defined by the crowded margins around it. It was negative space, a shape pressed into existence by pressure. In early November, orders finally came. Third Army's forward command post would relocate to a new site as the line shifted and command efficiency demanded it. In the hurried days of packing, files had to be culled. Material that could not be carried and was not absolutely classified was burned under supervision. In the yard, an old gasoline drum had been turned into an improvised burn barrel. Orange flames jumped inside. A military policeman stood nearby on watch. Miller carried a box filled with expired intelligence copies, draft paper, and irrelevant communications logs to the barrel. He fed in stacks of paper. Sheets curled, blackened, and became ash with sparks that lifted and died quickly in the damp air. Firelight lit his face. His fingers touched the hardbound notebook at the bottom of the box. He paused. The MP's gaze flicked over, then away, staying on the flame. Miller's hand rested on the rough cover for a few seconds. The fire crackled, consuming more unneeded memory. In his mind, images flashed. The hooded lamp over the briefing sheets, Chase's exhausted face, the hospital smells, the mud-choked roads, the shouting behind the door, the lines of analysis he had written. The notebook contained no secrets. It recorded a process of understanding, a private witness to what war did to a mind. He made his decision quickly. The motion was smooth and unremarkable, without hesitation. He took the notebook without opening it, folded it in half, the cover giving a slight protest, then bending as if to sort what remained in the box, slipped the folded notebook fast and neatly into the inner pocket of his field jacket. The pocket was deep. The notebook settled without showing a clear outline. He straightened, tossed the last few sheets into the barrel, and the flames jumped, then steadied. "All done, Sergeant," he said to the MP. The MP nodded and wrote something on a form. Miller picked up the empty box and turned away from the brief warmth of the fire toward the vehicles being staged for movement. Lorraine's cold wrapped him again. Inside his jacket, the hardbound notebook lay against his chest, making a nearly inaudible friction with each step. He would not hand it to anyone. He would not often reread it. It would be locked at the bottom of his personal gear, carried through relocations, perhaps carried home to some peaceful country where it would sit in the corner of a drawer and be slowly forgotten. But it had existed. He chose to keep it. He kept it not to prove Patton's silence and not to expose any hidden truth. He kept it for a private reason only. To remember that in Lorraine's cold autumn of 1944, he had watched firsthand how war, concrete and petty and crushingly heavy, could fill a commander's mental space so completely that there was no room left for even the briefest remark about a dead enemy. The blank margin on the briefing sheet became, in the end, his silent monument to the war's cruelty. He carried that small, unknown secret as he climbed onto a truck and merged into the flow of units moving out. Ahead, the war continued,